Well, welcome everyone. We are continuing into our second series of the Roadmap to the Bible series. For those who are familiar with the series, basically it's just a chronological book-by-book view into the Bible, especially if you've come up and maybe you've seen different devotionals, kind of, pick and choose different stories of the Bible, but it all didn't really connect with you. This is going to be a great way to go chronologically, one book of the Bible at a time, and kind of see the big picture of how the books relate to one another and unfold as events aspire throughout the Bible. Where we left off last, we were in the story of Moses, where he was in the living in Egypt and getting the Israelites to escape from Pharaoh. God miraculously gets them across the sea. They are in the wilderness and God provides for them there. There were unfortunate events. There was a rebellion. There were complaining. There was a lot of complications leading to God doing a 40-year curse to the Israelites, where that generation would die off and the second generation would go on to the promised land. And Moses and Aaron themselves at the water of Meribah were disqualified and were not able to themselves go into the promised land. And so the book that we're going into today, the book of Joshua, is going to lead off right where Deuteronomy left, where Moses dies and is succeeded by his attendant named Joshua. So that's where we're going to lead off in the book of Joshua. And before we get into the first chapter, we're going to break down the book a little bit by section. So the very first section of Joshua, chapters 1 through 12, really the first half of the book, is going to be all about the conquest. This is going to be how Joshua will continue into west of the Jordan River and take out each of the different regions. And the first, it will be pretty much divided in three different campaigns. So the first campaign is going to be the middle, directly across the river in the city of Jericho and Ai, which will be the middle campaign. Then he'll have a southern campaign where he'll take the towns in the south region, and then the north region is going to round out the book of Conquest. So that's going to be the first 12 chapters. The next chapters, 13 to 21, that's going to be the book of the settlement. So this is going to be what happens after the conquest, how they divide up each of the lands. And so that is a very grueling process. And so the book goes through all the different tribes and how each of the lands and the towns within the tribes are going to be divided up. So that's going to be most of the second half of the book. But then at the very end, the last 4 chapters, there's going to be a short epilogue, which are going to contain a few miscellaneous stories and end with the death and burial of Joshua and the high priest Eliezer. So that is the book of Joshua in a nutshell. Now let's go back to chapter 1 where we start off. So just as Deuteronomy ended, Moses dies and is buried. And the Lord will affirm Joshua to succeed Moses and instructs him to prepare a crossing into the promised land in 3 days' time. Before they cross, if you remember, the Transjordan tribes already have their allotted land right where they are, east of the Jordan River, on the Canaanite kingdoms that Moses brought to heel. So Joshua goes and tells them to settle their families, settle their flocks in the land that's already appropriated to them, and then the men will come and prepare to help their brethren in battle in the new frontier that's about to happen. Before they cross the river, in chapter 2, we get to the story of Rahab. So before crossing, Joshua is going to send out 2 spies to scope out the land to see, to get intel on the nearby land. And so the spies go across the river and they encounter this town of Jericho. So Jericho is going to, they're going to be lodged by a harlot near the town gate who actually lives on the outside wall of the city of Jericho named Rahab. And so the king of Jericho is going to get word that Rahab is hiding out these spies, so he sends men to go investigate. And the men find Rahab. Rahab misdirects them she says, "Oh, I just saw them. They went that way outside the town gate," and so they're going on a wild goose chase outside the town gate. And Rahab goes up where they hid the two spies, which was up on the roof under a heap of dead straw. And so she goes and tells the spies, and she tells them all these rumors that have been spreading throughout the land about this great God Yahweh who has gotten the Israelites out of Egypt, which was the worldwide empire at that time, and how he went and brought him to the Transjordan region and conquered those two kings. And so she knows that the Lord is with the Israelite people, and she has only one request, that the Israelites, once they conquer the land, to spare her and her family. And so the spies make an oath with Rahab, as long as she doesn't rat them out, that she will be saved. So as the two spies are leaving and escape through Rahab's window, the spies instruct her to take a crimson knot, a crimson tie, and tie it to the window, so that whenever the Israelites do come, that they know, they can recognize, okay, we're going to spare this house, we're going to spare Rahab's house, so that's how they know. And so Rahab, instead of telling them to go right back to the Jordan towards Joshua, she says, hey, the men are going to find you, go the opposite direction, go to the cave going towards Bethel, and hide out in the caves there. And so that they do. So they hide for 3 days, elude them, and then will return back to Joshua. So the two spies report what Rahab told them, that the rumors have heard of the Lord, their God, have done these great things, and that there's so much fear in the towns of Israelites, the great God that's behind them. So Joshua is really thrilled, he's excited, and the next morning he is ready to finally cross. And our first slide is going to go over the central campaign, starting in Shechem, where Deuteronomy ended. So the next morning they set out, they spend the night on the riverbank for 3 days, and they make this elaborate march where the ark and the Levitical priests are going to go first. And when the priests go and touch the foot of the river, miraculously, the stem of the river tide stops and is stemmed, and so the priest will walk onto the middle of the river on dry land, and so that makes a path for the army. So the army will march across this miraculous river, and the Lord goes and tells Joshua as they're crossing to have each tribe have a representative to go to where the priests are in the middle of the bank and collect 12 stones, like a big stone each, and it's going to be used to create a monument for future generations to mark this amazing miracle of what the Lord has done, and it's going to be placed at their night camp. So they follow the directions, they go and collect a stone, and they put it in their night camp nearby Jericho in a place called Gilgal, which is one of the notable locations that I want you guys to recognize. Gilgal is going to be Israelite HQ for now. That is where their base is going to be. After each and every campaign, they're always going to rally back and meet up at Gilgal. That is going to be their headquarters for their military operation. And so they go to Gilgal. After crossing, the Canaanite kings hear of God's miracles and begin to lose heart. And in preparation, remember that this is the second generation of the Exodus, and during their time in the wilderness, they actually never got circumcised. I guess they didn't have the tools to do it. And so now this generation is preparing to enter in and becoming God's people through circumcision. And during their celebration afterwards, during the Passover feast, they celebrate for the very first time having the grain of the land promised to them, this promised land of milk and honey. And which is a big turning point, because if you remember, throughout the wilderness, what happened? They had just manna and quail for years and years and years, and finally they've ceased because they've entered the promised land. They're enjoying the grains of the promised land, and now God has ceased giving them manna, marking the very end of their wanderings in the wilderness. So, right before, and the last part of the preparation story is an interesting encounter Joshua has with the army general of the Lord of Hosts. An angel is encountered in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, and makes a connection between Joshua and Moses. We see the connection with the separating of the Jordan. We see him also make a connection with Moses through this angel, which is like during the burning bush episode, the angel will tell Joshua to remove his sandals, for this is holy ground, just like the burning bush episode. So this happens, and now they are ready to enter into Jericho, if you see on this map. And so now they are entering Jericho, and the Lord gives them some peculiar instructions to conquer this city. So Joshua will set up a siege. He'll set up a blockade that will basically block all entry in and out of the city. And the Lord gives them instructions during this time for the next 6 days to march one lap around the city with the Ark of the Covenant. And during this march, you'll have the priests blowing ram horns each of these days. So they're going to do this for the next 6 days. And on the 7th day, they're not only going to do this once, they're going to do this 7 different times. 7 times they're going to go make laps. And then at the final lap, there's going to be a final blow the horn. And then once that blow happens, they're going to all let out a cry, and the walls are going to crumble. So that is the Lord's instructions. In addition, once they go and plunder the city, they are to place Jericho under harem. So if you remember the story of the Midianites in Numbers, this is basically utter destruction. So they are not to leave any survivors. There should be no cattle, no spoils whatsoever. And any precious metal or precious material that they do find, it will need to be donated to the tabernacle. So those are the Lord's specific instructions. Those instructions are followed for the most part, except one soldier named Achan will hoard some of that shekel and gold for himself. So Joshua will succeed in this. The walls crumble. They go and storm Jericho. And Joshua allows the 2 spies to go find Rahab in her household and safely escort her and her family to the Israelite camp. And then the conquest will end by Joshua in chapter 6, verse 26. He'll do a curse to the city of Jericho, and that ends the conquest of Jericho. Now, the second part, after the success in Jericho, there's another nearby city, if you look on the map, called Ai. And just like Jericho, Joshua will send out spies to get intelligence on the city. And the spies come back and report back to Joshua, telling him that there are going to be just a small city. So it's not as big as Jericho. It's not going to be as intimidating. You don't need the whole army. Just bring about a handful of troopers to get the job done. So Joshua goes and sends 300 men to take the city, and it does not go well. The men are routed. They have to flee, and many of them die on their way descending from the city. So the men of Ai just completely devastate them. And word of this gets back to Joshua, and he is just devastated, not only because of a defeat, but God has a winning record. He's undefeated. If God was with him, then the battle should have been won. So this is a terrible omen, showing that the Lord is indeed not with Joshua during this time. So Joshua is just panicking. And after a while, the Lord will come to Joshua and tell him that the covenant was not fulfilled, that the Israelites did not put their end of the agreement, and did not put the city of Jericho before into harem, and say that there is spoils that should have been prescribed among you. And so after that, Joshua will the next day will lead an investigation to find out. And the way he does this is interesting. If you remember from the book of Leviticus, the high priest will have a ephod, this really cool square breastplate with the 12 stones of Israel on him. And behind it is a device called the Urim and Thummim. And what this is we don't really know what it is exactly, but what Scripture basically describes it as a way to decipher the Lord's will. And it's done by some sort of binary way, because it can only answer so many things at once. So for example, when they do this investigation, they have to go they can't just reveal the person. They have to go by, is it this tribe, is it this clan, is it this family, and kind of go by elimination. And so they break it down by tribe, by clan, and then by family, and then by individual. And then the device arrives and concludes that Achan is the guilty person. So Achan comes forward, he admits his fault, and he stands guilty in front of Joshua, saying that he hoarded a mantle and some gold and silver shekels into his camp underneath his tent. So the men will go investigate, go and find the contraband inside of Achan's tent, and after it's unburied and found, then what they do is they go, and it's not a happy ending for him. He goes, not just himself, his family, all of his possessions are in this valley of Achor, and they are done what should have been originally done to the material, the contraband, which is to prescribe it, to completely burn it. So Achan, his family, and his cattle, and all of his possessions are burned along with the metal and shekels that he hoarded. So he is burnt, and then afterwards they stone him and bury him in stones, which back in ancient times, stone burial would be a show of disgrace. So after that, the Lord's anger subsides, and Joshua will do a second try at conquering Ai. And so this time, the Lord instructs him to take all of his troops and permits them as a bonus to take spoils and cattle for themselves. So Joshua will have a strategy to this. So this time Joshua will send a hidden unit behind the city, an ambush unit that will lay down overnight behind the city near Bethel, right here. So it's in between these 2 points. And while he will take the north point and does a full frontal attack. And so he goes and does a full frontal attack, and it's going to be just like last time. They think, okay, he's going to have this decoy unit, and the men of Ai think, oh, is this going to be last time? We're going to go and chase the Israelites again, and they're going to lose again, just like they did the first time. So they go out the city, and once all of the army of Ai is outside the city, Joshua will raise a javelin, and this javelin will signify to the ambush unit that you can come on in and take out the city. So once the army is driven outside, he holds up the javelin, the ambush unit comes in, burns down the city, and the army behind them sees that there's smoke, there's fire happening in their city, and they panic, and in the panic, Joshua will turn back, and the decoy unit will turn around and fight, and then the ambush unit will come meet them outside the gate, and they'll sandwich the army in and just slaughter the army of Ai. So they get decimated, and Joshua has a resounding victory against them and takes the town. So that concludes their initial central campaign. So this is the first episode. They still have a southern and a northern campaign to go, but this is the end of the central. And so after the end of the central campaign, they will go to Shechem, up way up north up here, at the end of this yellow line, into Shechem. And there they will do and fulfill, if you remember back in Deuteronomy 27, Moses gave instructions for once you reach the promised land to go to this mountain, Mount Gizamim, and Mount Ebal is also right next to here, and go and write down the Deuteronomic Code. So the book of Deuteronomy, all the laws that were within it are going to be inscribed into the town of Shechem. And once they're inscribed, they're going to go on top of the mountain and say a series of elaborate curses and blessings. And so the Israelites fulfill what Moses instructed them to do. And that kind of concludes the episode of the first campaign, the central campaign. Next is the southern campaign. So we're starting here in Gilgal. There we go. So we're starting here in Gilgal, the Jordan River's right here, and now they're going to go south. And the first town that they're going to go to is Gibeon. So the word gets around the other tribes. And remember that the Canaanite nation is not one united kingdom. It is a collection of various different tribes vying for power, independent kings. But once word gets to the others that the fate of Ai and the fate of Jericho, they start to panic. They're like, okay, we need to gang up together to form a front against these Israelite invaders. So they gather, and for the most part, they all gather and they make up a front against the Israelites, for one exception. The major city of Gibeon does not do this, and in fact, they do a clever trick to the Israelites. What they'll do is that they find just these really terrible rags. They put really worn out sandals on their feet, and they go pleading for mercy to the Israelites, acting like they're these foreigners just like them, from some faraway land, looking for mercy. And so Joshua accepts them as refugees and allows them to live among the Israelites and makes an oath with them to not attack their towns or attack their people. So 3 days later, when they're about to attack the town of Gibeon, turns out we tricked you, and we're actually locals that are natives here. And so Joshua is tricked, and because of this oath, they're not actually able to take the towns of Gibeon. And so Joshua hears about this, and he is just enraged, and he tells them, he just condemns the Gibeon people and says that you're going to be these lowly servants to the Levites. So they just are kind of these lowly servants, kind of the janitors of the Levites, doing these menial work for them. And so after that, word gets to the coalition that Gibeon has defected to the Israelites. And so they are not happy. And a particular king named Adonizedek from Jebus. Jebus is going to be a big deal later because it's going to be a town called Jerusalem, which will be a big deal later down the road. So the Jebusite king named Adonizedek will form a coalition of 4 other southern kings, and they're going to have a frontal attack against Gibeon for betraying this alliance. And so they attack them. And the Gibeonites are like, oh my goodness, we're under attack. Let's go back to Gilgal and let Joshua know so they can help us. So Joshua gets word of this and are afraid because now the Canaanites are ganging up and working with each other. So he goes and he helps the Gibeonites in Gibeon. And Joshua will do a night ambush against the coalition, sends them into a panic, and then they retreat. And not only do they retreat, God will send this miraculous, kind of like a miraculous hailstorm, and it just takes out everybody. So it just takes out this coalition through their great numbers. God just decimates them with this hailstorm, and Joshua will win this battle. And so intelligence informs Joshua that the 5 kings are hiding out south. So Gibeon is over here, where my mouse is, and then down south, all the way here in Makkedah, they're going to be hiding out in these caves. And so Joshua will sneakily go into Makkedah to the caves and start to board them in, actually just place stones in front of them and have people guard it. And so with the kings trapped inside, without their military leaders, Joshua can take out and whatever remnant of the coalition is left, he'll take them out and wipe them out without their leaders. So they do that, and then they go back to the cave of Makkedah once the coalition is defeated, and he will step on the necks of these kings and execute them on the stake, and then bury them back again in disgrace with stones back into the cave. And the southern campaign ends with a summary in chapter 10, verses 20 through 43. It's just a very, very long list of all the cities throughout southern Canaan that Joshua took hold of. And then after the southern campaign, of course, he returns back to Gilgal, the headquarters. So that concludes the southern campaign, and now we are at our last campaign, the northern campaign. So Gilgal is going to be down here now. And So news of this conquest now reaches up north to King of Hazor, which is up here north of the Sea of Galilee. And King Jabin has what we can tell is the largest capital within Canaan at this time. So out of all the independent kingdoms, Hazor is probably the greatest. So Hazor collects a great force of not only the remaining northern tribes, but also the western tribes near the Mediterranean Sea. So this big, diverse coalition of different Canaanite nations are going to come together and do battle with Joshua in this place called Miriam. So the waters of Miriam right here, they're going to have a huge battle west of the Sea of Galilee. And of course, the Lord is going to be with Joshua, and Joshua will take them out. It's notable too because these are not just any army, they're more advanced than Joshua's army. They have chariots and iron and chariots and horses. But nevertheless, Joshua will hamstring the chariots and the Israelites will defeat them. But it does give a caveat that even though Hazor is utterly destroyed and the cities were captured, there were still remaining cities that were not taken, most notably cities in the west, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. And if you know if those cities sound familiar to you, they're going to be major cities of a new threat that's going to arise later on as we get into the Bible, named the Philistines. And so when we get to the story of David, that tribe is going to be quite a big deal. So those cities were not taken by the Israelites. And at the end of the northern campaign, Joshua clarifies a few things. We might ask ourselves, why is Joshua just exterminating these people? Wasn't there peaceful resolutions? But Joshua chapter 11, verses 18 through 20 clarifies this, that the God stiffened the hearts of these leaders, and none of the towns ever sought peaceful arrangements with the Israelites. And so they all declared war against Joshua. So that concludes the northern campaign. And then chapter 12, the whole chapter is dedicated as a summary of not just Joshua's conquerings, but also Moses' conquerings before the Ammonite kingdoms east of the Jordan River are included. So that is what chapter 12 is all about. And now we are at the second half of the book of Joshua, into the book of the settlement. And the book of the settlement is all about the allocation of the lands after Joshua completed his conquest. So chapter 13, the first part of the book of the settlement, Joshua is growing old, and the Lord comes to him and informs him that the remaining territories, there are remaining territories to conquer, and promises to deliver the lands of Israel and to divide what they have conquered so far among the tribes. And so chapter 13 basically talks about the eastern allotment. It's basically a review. These lands were already allotted, if you remember, by Moses before he died, by Reuben, Gad, and the tribe of Manasseh, the half-tribe of Manasseh. And so that is just a review in chapter 13, verses 8 through 33. You can review that there. And now comes to Joshua's part where he has to be responsible for the western allocation of his new conquered lands. And it's going to take place in two parts. So the first three tribes, Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh, are going to get their portions in Gilgal, and then they're going to move to Shiloh and divide the rest of the lands among the remaining 7 tribes. So the tribe of Judah comes first to Joshua for their portion. Caleb, which if you remember, he is, with Joshua, the only remainder living person that survived from Moses' generation. And so Caleb was like, hey, remember back when Moses promised me this really nice chunk of land in Hebron? And Hebron is nice real estate because if you remember way back to Abraham's time, what was Abraham's first settlement when he came to Canaan? It was Hebron. So it was a major settlement site in a very good part of the hill country. So Caleb claims that real estate with the caveat that he still has to drive out some of the natives. And so Caleb gets the hill country in Hebron, and there's a story in chapter 15, verses 13 through 19 about his conquest of the rest against the Anakites in Hebron. And I bring that up as noteworthy because we're going to be introduced to a character, a kinsman, a younger kinsman of Caleb named Othniel. And Othniel will help lead and conquest the land and wins the hand of Caleb's daughter in marriage. And he's not significant now, but he will be in our next book because if some of you may know, he is going to be the very first judge in the list of judges. So he is introduced first here in the book of Joshua. So just keep him in the back of your mind. And so Caleb's portion is living out first, and then the rest of the tribe of Judah's boundary is described in chapter 15, verses 1 through 12. Their cities are described in verses 20 through 62. And verse 63 is significant because it notes that Judah did not conquer the Jebusites living in Jerusalem. Because why? When is that finally conquered by? It's not conquered until 2 Samuel, when David becomes king, and he will conquer the Jebusites in Jerusalem and make that a central city, uniting all the different tribes of Israel under his monarchy. So that is an important city to keep in mind in the future. So after Judah, next is Ephraim. Their portion is described in chapter 16, verses 5 through 10. Manasseh is next. Their boundaries are described in chapter 17, verses 7 through 11. A few things to note about Manasseh. If you remember, Zephalahed, he died. He was a Manassehite who died in Moses' time, and he had no sons to carry the inheritance he was promised into the promised land. And there was this big debate about it, but Moses agreed to let the daughters inherit his land. So they now get their father's land. They now get that land. And Ephraim and Manasseh complained to Joshua, saying that their share is too small, but their land will grow more because they're going to further conquer the Perizzites and the Rephaim. Rephaim are these giant natives in the area, and so they're going to clear out some more forest land and gain a bigger foothold into Canaan. Okay, now that we get into the next part, we're going to move the scene. We're going from Gilgal, now we're going north up to Shiloh, and Shiloh is going to be a very important location for the first part of early Jewish settlement, because if you remember, the tabernacle is going to be set up there. And if you remember what the tabernacle is, it is where God's kavod is. We usually translate that word as glory, but it's his literal presence among the Israelites is in this portable temple almost that they had throughout the wilderness. And so that's going to rest in Shiloh. So that is going to be their place of worship. That's going to be their religious capital of the new settlement, is going to be in Shiloh. So the Israelites settle there with the tabernacle, and will divvy out the lands for the next 7 tribes. Joshua will command 3 men of each of the remaining tribes to go survey the leftover land. Once that survey is made, he's going to order them to cut it up in 7 parts, and after the 7 parts are made, he's going to just divide those 7 parts according to lots to the 7 tribes. So the first is going to be Benjamin. That's going to be chapter 18. Then Simeon. So all of this is going to be chapter 18 through 19. So first is going to be Benjamin, then Simeon, then Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, then Naphtali, and then finally Dan. And I'll take a moment to talk a little bit about Dan, because even though Dan has this portion right here, it's not going to last. This is just their initial portion that they get. They're eventually going to get driven out by the natives and subverted and have to migrate way up north, all the way up here near this circle. And that is going to happen. That's going to be later on in, I believe it's going to be Judges chapter 18. We're going to get to the full story of how Dan lost their land and had to migrate north. So something to look forward to when we get into Judges. Next, the last 2 chapters of the book of the settlement is going to talk about refuge cities and the Levite cities. So if you again remember from Deuteronomy, we mentioned refuge cities. For the Lord had very specific instructions for those who were accidental murderers. So those who did manslaughter but did it on accident. What happened back in that day, if someone gets killed, there wasn't a cop, there wasn't a murder detective back in that time. What you would do is you would have a kinsman or a relative go and avenge the person who murdered, your relative. So, a brother or an elder of the household would go and kill the murderer on the dead relative's behalf. And to protect those and to give them a fair trial, Moses prescribed 3 different locations on the east side of the Jordan. Those cities were Bezer, Ramoth Gilead, and Golan on the east side of the Jordan. And now Joshua is going to designate 3 for the west side of the Jordan, which is going to be in Kadesh, Shechem, and Hebron. Those are going to be the refuge cities for Jordan. And the Levites, if you remember, the Levites do not get a portion. They are dedicated to the tabernacle and the maintenance and the well-being of the kavod of the Lord. So they get special town districts within each of the portions, and those are going to be described starting with Aaron's descendants, and then you have the Canaanite, the Gershonite, and the Marianite clans listed in chapter 21. So chapter 21 covers all of the special towns that they have pastors in. And then the book of the settlement concludes with a reiteration of God's promises being fulfilled completely in chapter 21, verses 41 through 43. So that brings us finally to the end of the book of the settlement, and now we get this short epilogue at the end from Joshua 22 through 24, which basically just cover the aftermath. So after the conquerings, after the land has been divvied up, these are the following events that happened. So there is going to be, the first one is notable. So the Transjordan tribes are going to return, and there's going to be an altar controversy that almost sparks a civil war, which will be foreshadowing of an actual civil war that's going to be happening when we get to the book of Judges. But this one is thankfully averted. To summarize what happens is the Transjordan tribes, remember their home is east of the river, and Joshua gives them a round of high fives, like, you guys did great, thank you guys so much for coming and getting the land for your brethren. You can go back to your families back east of the river. And so they go, they don't go this way though, they don't go through, back to Shechem, they go up here, closer to the Jabbok River. I can't get a good picture of it. Closer to this area in the land of Galilee. Okay, it is, if you remember Galilee from the story of Jacob and Laban, that was where the mark was. The story took place in Gilead. And so they go to Gilead, and once they cross the river, they make an altar there. And it's not just any altar, it's like a replica of the tabernacle. And when word of this replica comes back to the west side of the river, people are upset. They're like, what? Why are they building another tabernacle? And so the other tribes are very upset. They want to declare war, thinking that they're going to have this alternative place of worship that's not where the Lord has chosen, outside the tabernacle. And so they're about to fight, but before they fight, they send kind of a diplomat to go investigate the matter. So they send Phinehas and 10 elders. And Phinehas is Eleazar's son. You probably remember him best in Numbers 25 at Baal-peor, where he stuck a spear in front of an Israelite and a prostitute to end a plague that was happening when the Israelites were messing around with the Midianites. Okay? So that happened in Numbers 25. So Phinehas goes and is diplomatic to the Transjordan tribes. They go to Gilead and confronts them. Phinehas is very angry. He's like, what are you guys thinking? Like, why do you have this replica tabernacle here? Are you guys going to worship here? Are you going to send offerings? And the Transjordan tribes respond, and they say, no, this is just a big misunderstanding. We are not doing any offerings. We're not doing gifts or any sacrifices here, but this is just a monument, a reminder. And what they're concerned about is that as generations go and go and go, there's just this significant boundary between them and the rest of the tribes through this river, and they're thinking that their children are going to forget them along the way, and they're going to forget about Shiloh, they're going to forget about the tabernacle, and so this replica is going to be a reminder of the tabernacle, of God's kavod, to keep them connected for their children for all time. So Phinehas hears this, he's satisfied, he's like, okay, this is a big misunderstanding. He goes back to the other tribes, and they celebrate because, they misunderstood, and crisis averted, no civil war ensues for now. So that ends that episode. The next episode in the epilogue is Joshua's farewell speech. So Joshua's growing old, he is dying, and he gives kind of one last farewell speech. And this is found in chapter 23, and I'm just going to go over a few of the highlights of the speech. Regarding the unconquered enclaves that the Canaanites still are existing, God hasn't forgot his promise. He's still going to drive out those nations in due time, but with the caveat to be more mindful that God is to be, his loyalty is to be to Yahweh only, and to not turn to other gods, to not intermingle with the native tribes, and to not intermarry with the natives, or else they will be a foothold, is what the scripture says. They will be a foothold, and you will not be able to drive them out. So God has not, and another thing that Joshua mentions is that God has not failed in any of his promises. But if you break your promise, if you break your covenant with the Lord, he will wipe you out just as he did the Canaanites. So just an ominous reminder to always be faithful to God, and don't be like the Canaanites, or else you'll have the same fate as the Canaanites. So after this speech, they then go up north to Shechem. Where is my Shechem map? Yep, right up here. And they do one last ceremony. So you remember they did the Deuteronomy ceremony. Now they're going to do another ceremony where Joshua is going to gather them for another covenant. And so the Lord is going to speak through Joshua and remind them of all the great things. So this is a big review of, everything that God has done for Abraham, everything he's done for Jacob and Joseph, everything he's done for Moses, getting him out, getting him through the wilderness, getting him to here, everything that happened to Joshua. So there's this big review of God's faithfulness. And after that, Joshua gives the people an ultimatum. After hearing all that the Lord has done, I give you this: are you going to serve the foreign gods of your forefathers, or are you going to worship the one true God, Yahweh? And so all of the tribes will answer unanimously and say, yes, we will worship the Lord only, Yahweh. And so cynically, Joshua doesn't make just any other monument. What he does is he inscribes this oath under a great stone on an oak tree. And not only is this altar a memorial for a reminder of this covenant, but it is a witness against them. He's like, okay, you say that you're going to accept the Lord as your God only. Well, guess what? This is going to be a witness against you if you do not fulfill that. So this will stand as a testament against you if you ever betray the Lord. And with that, the end of the covenant ceremony, Joshua and Eliezer, the high priest, will die. So Joshua will die at the ripe age of 110 and is buried in the share of his land up in Ephraim, his tribe. And Aaron's son Eliezer will also die, and will be buried by the district in his Levite, the son district, Phinehas, up on his hill. And also, a blast from the past, I like how this mentions it at the very end of Joshua. If you remember, the very last chapter of Genesis, Joseph didn't want to die and be buried in Egypt, and he wanted his bones back in his father's land. So at last, Joseph's long-awaited wish comes true, and they bring the bones of Joshua and bury it in Shechem, in the land his father purchased from Hamor, the father of Shechem, in Genesis 33, verses 19. And that closes us out with the book of Joshua, leaving us on an ominous note where there's no assumed successor to Joshua, and leaves Israel in a state of uncertainty. And we will see how that unfolds next time when we get into the book of Judges.